This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
As followers of Jesus, in whom all things were made, we acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the country on where this podcast is recorded. We recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this land and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and we extend that respect to all First Nations peoples listening today.
And, back in the day, we charged 10 cents for grooming. And anyway, we put a sign because, a young businesswoman knows that you advertise your business. So McGarp's vet service. And we put a terrible hand-painted sign outside our house, which drew the attention of the Victorian Veterinary Board, which wrote a very stern letter saying we weren't registered. And my poor mother had to ring and say, she is only 10. So they came to an agreement, and I had to change my name to McGarp's Pet Service. But what we did was we raised money for the RSPCA.
I'm Georgia, and welcome to Finding Hope, the podcast that reminds you of the good in the world. Each episode tells the story of someone who has found real hope in challenging times and made the world a better place. Episode 59, Susannah McFarlane. Susannah McFarlane is no stranger to a good story. She loves reading them, writing them, publishing them, and connecting with others through their own stories. She's an award-winning author, creator, and publisher of over 80 books. 80. Just let that sink in for a little bit. She's behind some of Australia's most successful children's series, including Zac Power, Go Girls, and EJ12 Girl Hero. Susannah is also the head of publishing at Bible Society Australia, and her own story of how she met Jesus is quite a remarkable one, stemming from a reunion with her birth mother in adulthood. It's an honour to have Susannah on Finding Hope today. Let's meet her. Susannah, it's an honour to have you on Finding Hope today.
Thanks, Georgia. Thanks for having me.
Let's go back to the beginning. Susannah, you were given up for adoption at birth, but you were raised by a wonderful, loving family. You had siblings. What was your childhood like as you remember it?
It was great. It was a rough start. Because I'm old, Georgia, when I was adopted, it was closed adoption, so total secrecy. So my birth mother was knocked out the moment that she delivered me, and I was picked up, no skin to skin. This is pre-attachment theory. Put in a crib where contact was limited because they didn't want me to imprint on the nurses. So, look, that was probably a tough 2 weeks, but I was adopted into the most beautiful, loving family where I grew up loved and loving, with all the normal ups and downs, but kind of opportunity and support and love. It was fun.
Did you kind of see the impact of those first 2 weeks? Yeah, the effects of that throughout your childhood, looking back?
I didn't. Looking back, I do as an adult. As a child, I didn't. My parents certainly did. Mum would say I was a very angry little girl, and she got that. I was very blessed to have a mother that realised what was going on, and she was also grieving because she'd lost two little girls, and that's what brought them to adoption. So she realised when she brought me home that I was grieving a mother I never met, and she was grieving her two little girls. And so she understood where the anger was coming from. But apparently I was not unused to having the tantrum. But Mum and Dad just poured love into me, that and a bit of therapy, and I was kind of healed. So I think I did act it out, but, I would never have said that as a child.
Yeah. Where does reading fit into all of this? Did you read a lot growing up? How did your love of books kind of manifest?
Reading fits in everywhere. So now I know that my birth parents were both English reader people. My birth father's a writer, poet. My birth mother studied English at university. I didn't know that at the time, but Mum and Dad, there were always books. Dad was an English lecturer, Mum was a librarian. So it was really look out if you didn't want to read, because they were kind of everywhere. And we were read to, and we were encouraged to read. And so I grew up, from my, favourite picture books into chapter books, and, never stopped.
Did you want to be a writer, a publisher? Like, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I desperately wanted to be a vet.
Oh.
I loved animals. And at one point, we had a very forgiving mother who also grew up on a farm, so she loved them. So at one point, I think we had about 17 animals in the house, which was a pity for my father because he did not like animals so much.
Oh, no.
But at one point, we had a dog, 5 cats. We had a pigeon that Mum had rescued. We had terrapins that my dad threw out by accident because he thought they were dead, but they were hibernating. We had budgies that bred. We had mice for a very short period of time before the cats got them. We even had 2 lambs that we were from a farm that mother you had died, and we took to school and they grazed on the oval. So there were animals everywhere. And you
didn't live on a farm yourself, though?
No, we did not. We lived in suburban Melbourne. So
Did your neighbours ever say anything?
The lambs raised a few eyebrows, walking a lamb on a lead in a Melbourne suburb. But that was just part of the happy childhood. But animals were everywhere, and animals were on our beds and under the dinner table, and, it was bliss.
And I understand that you were a bit of an early entrepreneur because you had your own little vet service as a 10-year-old, but you kind of got a bit in trouble with the law from it. Is that correct?
Yeah, Georgia, that was so funny. So I started a friend and I started something called McGarp's Vet Service, which was McGarp's was a mashing of our names, and we would inflict ourselves on the neighbourhood pets, and we'd offer to flea them and groom them. We had zero skills but massive enthusiasm. And, back in the day, we charged 10 cents for grooming. And anyway, we put a sign because, a young businesswoman knows that you advertise your business. So I wrote in terrible painting, McGarp's Vet Service. And we put a terrible hand-painted sign outside our house, which drew the attention of the Victorian Veterinary Board, which wrote a very stern letter saying we weren't registered. And my poor mother had to ring and say, she is only 10. So they came to an agreement, and I had to change my name to McGarp's Pet Service. But what we did was we raised money for the RSPCA.
That's
without kind of grooming. But really, we just kind of inflicted ourselves on the neighbourhood's generosity.
I love that. I also just love that your parents kind of just believed in you wholeheartedly, and they just backed you right from a young child. And it seems that you were just a go-getter, and you went after kind of what you want. Has that kind of gotten you to the point where you are today, publishing 80 books? Like, do you just kind of just say yes to things and just give everything a go?
I'm definitely a yes sayer, when perhaps sometimes I should be saying no. I'm definitely a yes sayer, and they certainly encourage that. They did try to put the brakes on occasionally. I mean, I was a little bit headlong into things and a bit of a hurtler. My mother used to describe me as having oppressively high spirits at times. So, there was a bit of curbing that needed to go on. But certainly I was encouraged to, try stuff and to do stuff and certainly to follow where I thought, my heart did. But it turned out I was terrible at maths. So my veterinary career never got off the ground because I
had to do so much maths and science.
So much maths and science that that was a fail, yeah.
Was that the realisation of that? Was that what led you down the creative path then?
I think by the time I realised I wasn't going to be a vet because of some fairly obvious science grades, I was already loving myself in English and English literature. And so then it became a question of, well, what will I do? And then, then university degrees were much more general. So I did an arts degree. I knew I didn't want to do law. I hate arguing. So law was not for me. But so I wanted to do arts. And then as you do arts, you sort of discover. And I thought, I want to do something that combines the business and the art. I didn't see myself as a creator at the time, which is kind of interesting, I think. Not sure why that happened, because my early writing career used to start with writing letters to my mother normally saying things like bad news inside, as I would confess some terrible action that I'd done, or I'd write my apologies and slip them under the door. So very early I knew that words was a way to communicate how we felt. And Mum kept them all. So, these little cute little handwritten envelopes with bad news inside, and open this when happy with me. And so it was very cute.
I like that. But I think I was also very similar as a child, but I think writing words down allows you to process it in your head first and then kind of put it out on paper. And I think is that kind of the reason why you hate arguing as well, because you want time to process those thoughts and feelings?
I'm an extrovert in the sense of that's where I get my energy from. I love talking to people, and I often get my ideas as I talk, some of which surprise me and are, to the good or the bad. So I'm definitely not a ponderer. And when I write, I'm often surprised what comes out, which I think most people will say, that something special happens when you begin to write. And stuff comes out and you go with it. And that's, I think, when you're not writing an essay or you're not writing something instructional, and you just kind of follow that thread. I just don't like debating because I don't kind of see the point. But I love talking, as you might be gathering. And I think the best ideas can often come from conversation.
So how did you actually get into the book industry? So you did your arts degree and you wanted to go into that business side.
So my dad was helping to write English textbooks at the time. And so I thought, maybe publishing is something, that kind of fusion of business and art. And so I had a work experience job doing permissions, which is a pretty boring part of publishing, which is when if you're reproducing other people's work, you need to apply for permission. So and it was a textbook on poetry, so there's a lot of permission you need to get. So I went in and did that job, and while I sort of liked feeling like I was a grown-up, I could also watch what other people were doing, and I just loved it. I'd like to be in this. So I applied for the most junior job that was available, which was an editorial secretary. This was in the day when secretaries, typed and did shorthand, and I had none of those skills, so that was a bit of a setback. And in fact, when I did my typing test, I put my speed as the speed that it was immediately after finished my 5-day intensive typing course, which was a bit delusional. Anyway, I think I failed the test and I didn't get the job. They gave it to someone who, lo and behold, had secretarial skills. But luckily she left running off with the Christmas Club money, I believe. So I got it by default.
Oh,
So I was super lucky. And then I got that job and I worked my way up through editorial, and I was a terrible editor. I didn't have the attention to detail. I was working on a book which was natural disasters, and I flipped all the photos so the disasters looked even more terrible than they were. They were all upside down. So the wise people at the publishing company thought, let's move her into marketing. Perhaps she's a bore, which I loved. And, I think I've had over now 25 jobs in publishing. And it's just the best industry because you get to work with amazing people. You get to create something from nothing and give, an amazing gift. I've spent most of my time in children's publishing, and I just fell in love with that, partly because I think I'm still a bit immature. So, you get to hang out in that. But I think there's a child, well, God knows that, doesn't he? There's a child in all of us, and that child needs to be kind of nurtured, and the child is where the fun stuff can happen. So, it's been a fantastic blessing.
That's so great. And look, you have published over 80 children's books, 1 million copies sold in Australia alone, which is just absolutely remarkable. It's clear that you understand kids, you understand the stories that they love. How have you honed that skill over time?
I think by being with them and respecting them, and respecting their little minds. It's a long time since I was a child, and while many things have changed, I think some things are universal, and kids' sense of fairness and the things that happen, we all still have problems with our friends, we all worry. So some of those things don't change from the generation, that the forces that kind of act on them might. So I just try to stick close to a child. I think the best kids' books are written for specific children or with a specific child in mind. So if you think about Winnie the Pooh, was A.A. Milne writing for Christopher. Reverend Audrey, who I had the great honour to meet when I was a publisher in the UK, wrote specifically for his son Christopher when he had the measles. So I think once you lose sight of that child, the adult can take over too much, and you can write clever books which might not necessarily engage the child. So I try to keep low and connected to the kids, but still respecting the incredible sophistication that they have of their emotions. And, they have the same complex emotions that we do. They're just not as used to unpacking them. So, and that's why I like to write books that respect that and acknowledge their emotions, not that they'd ever notice that happening, and give them sort of a hopeful ending. All my books have to have happy endings. I'm a big happy ending person.
I think that's smart. You write with specific kids in mind?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, EJ12, which ended up being a 21-book series, I wrote with my daughter in mind, and then her friends, and then the readers that used to write in, so which was super fun. They'd go, hey, why don't you do this? And I'd go, well, why don't I? So I'd give EJ a friend or something. But EJ started off as Emma, who's my daughter.
Oh, lovely. What's your writing process like?
Terrible.
Do you have... Do you just kind of write when you get time? Do you have a specific time and place? And
I should do those things, George. So writing is a practice and it's work. And if you just hung around waiting for creativity to happen, good luck with that. It's never. You have to just commit to it. And often the best way I avoid writing is reading about writing, because that's, you kind of think you're doing something, and you have to show up. You have to put your bottom on the chair and do something, and then trust the process. So I avoid, my house is never cleaner than when I'm on a writing deadline, because everything just, there's 46 things I find I have to do before I sit down to writing. But no, do it regularly. Don't be afraid, don't be afraid of the empty page. You can fix the most terrible drivel, but you can't fix a blank page. So, you get something down and you go, what a disaster. But then you might find something that's the kernel of something else. And it may not be what you thought you were writing, which is the fun thing. I do think we don't do magic. I do think God's in it, that you've been given gifts and talents and you just lean into that and see what happens. And I do think, God's a creator God. We're made in his image. So I think we create out of something that's a bit more spiritual than just putting words on the page. I think that's typesetting. I think writing's something different.
I love that. Susannah, I would love to talk a little bit more about your personal journey, especially finding and reconnecting with your birth family. Growing up, do you remember having any interest or desire to find your birth family?
Total denial. So there was a telling thing which I do remember, and when I was in year 3, and I was in year 3 in the 70s when there was a lot of Vietnamese immigration. So that was people kind of knew, and there were kids who were adopted from other families and things. And I'd forgotten my lunch, and Mum, bless her, had brought my lunch to school. And someone the day before had said, oh, you don't look like your mum. And I said, oh, that's because I'm adopted, because I was always told. There was never any I said, oh, that's because I'm adopted. And they went, oh, what does that mean? Do you come from Vietnam? And I said, no. Anyway, so I thought the problem was with them. But then when Mum came to school with my lunch, this child, which is not their fault because, she bought my lunch, and the child yelled out, don't take your lunch from her. She's not your real mother. And the school almost went into lockdown. I didn't actually. I thought, what are they going on about? I'm fine. I know who my mother is. It's this kid's problem. But I think the work that Mum had done and some therapy to bond me to Mum was so absolute. Mum tells a story did tell a story when I was 2 years old, and I'd squared off against her in a room, and I looked at her and I said, are you my mother? And she took a deep breath and said, yes, and I tore across the room into her arms. And I think that's the moment where I connected and I locked in. So nothing for me was going to break that lock, not even my birth mother. So people would say, when I was a bit older, people would say, oh, don't you want to find your real parents? Or, people who are a bit more knowledgeable, don't you want to find your birth parents? And I'd go, no, why should I? I've got my family. This is my family. These are my parents. And I think looking back, what I was doing was protecting. Why would I risk the mother who stayed for the mother who left? So I just shut it down. So, which was fine because in the olden days, I couldn't have found them anyway. The laws were such that everything was sealed. But in the 1980s, they changed the law in line with the UN Convention for the Rights of Children that said every child has a right to know where they come from. And all bets were off. So suddenly you could get access. So I'm 22 at work, having been rescued from the editorial department and the marketing department. And I get a call from a social worker to say, your mother would like to meet you. And I said, no, my mum's at home. So very badly handled. I ended up receiving a letter from my birth mother, and would I meet? And I remember telling my mother, like came home from work and I showed her the letter and I just saw her face crumble before she had time to put together a response. And I knew at that moment there was no way I was going to meet. There was no way I was going to pull on this thread because the risk for me was too great. So I shut it down totally. And I wrote Robin. So Mum, every now and then I'd ask Mum, what was my birth mother called? And Mum would give me the name because that's all she had. And I'd forget it, which I think is telling. So every couple of years I'd go, what was that woman's name again? And she'd say Robin, and I'd trot off and go and flee a dog or something and then forget about it again. So Robin wrote this letter saying, that's fine. I understand. And I always remembered, she said, just think of someone who's thinking well for you in the background. And interestingly now, she finished with God bless Susannah. And I thought nothing more about it. I didn't think about, well, that's what I would say. Didn't think about her, certainly didn't think about the God that she was wishing blessing on. But every now and then, she lived in Melbourne and she'd written the address. I would drive, sunglasses on, trench coat on almost, down that street. And I think what I was doing was, will there be someone who looks like me? Because unless you're adopted, it's hard to get your head around. But until you have children of your own, there's not a human face you look into and you can see yourself in. And it's a really powerful, grounding, connecting thing. So I think something was happening down below, but I was so hyper vigilant to not learn, to not risk my family that I just pushed it all away.
What changed and prompted you the search and that eventual reunion?
A few things. So we have to fast forward to when I'm nearly 50. My mum had died, and I think, that probably had to happen. I think she might have been fine with it, but I wasn't, back to the risk. I'd had kids of my own, and that had made me think, gosh, what would that have been like to carry a baby and to have it taken away from you? And I'd started to get an awareness that I'd written a really terrible letter to Robin, with all the tact and sensitivity that a 21-year-old has, that it had been about me and not about her. And then I just had this thing, well, maybe I can write a better letter. Maybe if she's still alive, I can just be a bit more empathetic, say now that I've had kids, I realise how difficult that, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I went to get my file and there's this beautiful social worker who was assigned to me, which then I realised, Georgia, I'd been a case. I never thought I was going to be a case. And she said, we'll get your file. And I said, no, I don't need the file. I just need a contact name and address. And she was very patient, saying, no, I think you should read your file. I think you should absorb the whole, no, I don't want to do that. Anyway, I did read the file because I had to get the address. I did make contact. And, Georgia, I can't explain, but it was like, those old tennis ball cans? And when you open them, that was like what happened. This kind of something was just unlocked and unleashed, and immediately there was this connection. And I desperately wanted to communicate with this woman. And so there was quite a feverish exchange of emails, helped mediated by the social worker, then letters. And then I knew, the idea of just writing a better letter was long gone. And I really wanted or needed to meet her.
How did that go?
It was amazing. We were supposed to have an hour meeting mediated by the social worker. At 2 hours, we sent the social worker home, and 8 hours later we left.
Wow. And
it was such a mind blow. This woman, they talk about it as intimate strangers. Like in one way, she is the most intimate relation to me, as the woman who carried me and gave birth to me. But equally, she was a total stranger. But yet there was just this easy connection, and there was like these clickings into place. And so we just talked and, listened, and it went on like that. And it was intense, but it was also, it was a lot. There's 50 years of lives and stuff happens. And ultimately you need to have a lot of forgiveness, because I found out that the story was told to me, which your birth mother loved you very much and she couldn't keep you, so now we have you, which I do believe is the only story you would tell a small child. But the reality is she didn't want to keep me. And because Robin, who'd since become a Christian, everything had to be based on truth. So when I was with her only about 3 weeks after I'd met her and I was telling her what I was told, it really sat on her heart that I was labouring under a misconception. So she took a deep breath and said, I didn't want you then. And Georgia, I can't begin to tell you the heart punch that was. And I got up out of her house, we were at her house, and I walked out. And really the only reason I came back was because A, I'd forgotten my handbag, and B, she was an old woman and she'd made lunch and I didn't want to be rude. So I walked back in and said, and in my head, I thought I was just going to stay for lunch and then I was going to beat out and I was never going to, but something happened and I stayed, and, she said, but I do want you now. Mm. So it was tough.
Do you regret knowing?
No. I think everyone needs to know where they came from. Everyone needs to know. And the reality is I have 2 sets of parents. And I talk now with adoption counsellors and trying to give them that lived experience. And it's not the child's fault. I didn't do it. But I do have 2 mothers and 2 fathers. And so I actually call my birth mother mum now, but I can talk about my 2 mums in the one sentence, and it's just for everyone else to work it out by context who I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't owe that explanation every time to everyone. Absolutely not.
Could you imagine back in 1965? No, so we just...
Were you able to connect with any more members of your birth family, your birth father,
everyone.
brothers, sisters? Yeah.
And because, look, I was a product literally of the, kind of promiscuous 60s. So there were kids everywhere in all different configurations. And but so I had my birth mother went on to marry my birth father. And so I had 2 full blood sisters.
Wow.
Who I also met. And my daughter to this day says, oh, if I ever lost you, Mum, I'd go and talk to Anna a lot because then it'd be like talking to you. And even things that you would have swore, like needless to say, I was a big nurture over nature girl as growing up. But there's some undeniable pulls of nature. So my birth sister and I both slap our knee in a kind of raucous cowboy way when we're laughing, exactly the same, that you would swear would have to be, acquired, but turns out genetic. Or when we're nervous, we both bite our lip in the same way. So that's been a joy. And even it's been a joy for my children because they too are looking at their bloodline, which they couldn't do before. So, but it was, as I said, super difficult. And very few reunions end up being long-standing relationships. And I think some terrible percentage. And honestly, if I hadn't become a Christian in the middle of it and let God show me how to forgive, I don't think we would have survived, because you have to forgive the most fundamental soul wound. And I couldn't have done that in my own strength, I don't think.
Wow, that's powerful. And let's talk about this, because I just find this the most remarkable story that you found Jesus through all of this. Tell me about how this came about. Obviously, you had the God bless Susannah in the letter.
Yeah, and then the rest of the time, I went to a nominally Anglican school, and there'd be a hymn and a prayer. And I think Mum went to church. I now know from reading her poems and letters that she became a Christian, a sort of not cultural, but a proper Christian when she was about 50. But otherwise it was church. We were put through Sunday school, which I hated. But I was confirmed in good faith, but I was much more interested in the double album of Greece that I got than I was the book about Jesus. And then the a few negative things happened. So the guy who confirmed us ran off with a married member of the congregation. And I went, oh, well, what does that say? You've just been teaching us the 10 Commandments. And so I wasn't cross at God, but there was a kind of disenchantment with church. And no one had ever said to me that God was a person who I could have a relationship with and that loved me and wanted to have a relationship. That was never a thing. So I just went on with my life, and occasionally you'd be at a church service for the kids' school or something, and there'd be a beautiful soaring descants of sopranos, and your kind of heart wanders upwards, doesn't it, when you hear beautiful music? But I really thought nothing of it. So when I met Robin and she'd become a Christian, and all of a sudden she started talking about God and how he loved me and he wanted to meet me, and I thought, oh no, I finally, 50 years later, have met my birth mother, and she's mental. She's talking about this imaginary friend, and she's like bonkers, and she won't stop talking about it. And it was a real problem. First, it was funny. I thought, oh, God, she's just, happy clapper kind of thing, all the terrible things we say on the other side of faith. But she kept going, and it became a problem because I thought, I want to have a relationship with this woman, but she's nuts. So I now see in my own incompetent Lee Strobel kind of way, I embarked on my own case for Christ, where I would prove to her that God wasn't real and she could just go be a normal person and we could have a relationship. So I think we all know where this story goes, that because, I'd done history at university, so I was kind of researching it. Paul says if the resurrection didn't happen, then we're all fools. Our faith is based on nothing, and the resurrection's been called the epicenter of faith. And I got to the resurrection, and I remember writing bad word, oh, it's true. And it was not, hallelujah, it's true. It was, oh, man, it's true. Because I didn't want to be a Christian. I thought Christians were nuts. I got to this point where it was undeniable to me that the historical record showed that not only was there this guy called Jesus, but that he was crucified and he rose again. And if that was true, then everything else was true as well. And I was, it was in that moment, it's a bit like C.S. Lewis said, he knelt down and acknowledged God as one of the most unwilling converts in Christendom or something. But, so it was the reality of, so my head went first and my heart probably went about 2 weeks later when I was actually sitting on what was a Buddhist meditation cushion, and I just received, I can only describe it as a cosmic hug, this kind of warm sense of something. So very late life, I think it was about 51.
How did things change after that? Did you feel an immediate change, or was it more gradual?
Well, I did have this kind of cosmic hug, which I was grateful for, but then sometimes I wonder, well, where's that gone? When
Give me another one.
Yeah, exactly. But I think God is very kind to new Christians. I think he wants to cement the reality of himself with you, but then he also wants you to grow in your faith. So we walk by faith, not sight. So we walk by faith, not cosmic hugs the whole time. So I suppose everything and nothing changed. But the thing, I had to tell people. And
how did that go?
Terrible. I'd love to say the story has a great mountaintop finish, but actually my husband left me a few years later, and part of it was because he thought I'd gone mad. Everything that I thought about Robin, he thought about me, that I'd had some kind of midlife crisis brought on by my reunion, and I now believed in an imaginary friend. And not only did I believe in it, but I went to church every week. I spent time in prayer, and now I was publicly working for, I'd outed myself totally by working for Bible Society. Like there's nowhere to hide there, right? When you say where you work, and he couldn't cope with that. I think he's angry at a God he doesn't believe in. Yeah, so it was difficult. It's been amazing. And I think I do believe that God doesn't give us more than we can cope with, although sometimes it really feels like it. And I've spent a lot of time lamenting, But as a storyteller and a story reader, you can't help but admire God's storytelling in that first he brings me back to my birth mother and then she brings me back to him. I mean, that's just a cosmic fairy tale of the most kind of epic proportions.
And you actually co-wrote a gorgeous memoir with Robin called Heartlines, The Year I Met My Other Mother. Tell me, what was that writing process like?
It was a bit like the reunion itself. Like, it was a total trip. Like, it was great and really fun. But, there was some fairly surreal parts. Like, at one point, because Robin was tired, I was writing the bit for her, the kind of scaffolding of the bit where she first finds out she's pregnant. And I'm going, wow, okay. And then, and there was, some of it was quite triggering. Because they found out, and Robin is fine with telling this because it's in the book, she did try to get unpregnant. And it's only because she was incredibly naive and for reasons that still astound me, didn't realise she was pregnant until 4.5 months.
Oh.
Which, go figure that. But so she couldn't. And so that's why adoption became an option. So, but it was a lovely process, and I think I'm becoming a professional oversharer, which I'm not sure if that's good, but the point of writing it was if it might help other people to navigate the same kind of reunion path, but also because ultimately it's a story of forgiveness. It's what can happen if we lay down the right to avenge wrongs and things and just forgive and be open-hearted.
How has your faith changed the way that you tell stories?
I think it infuses everything. We hope it does. There's that tiny skerrick of Jesus that's in me has to kind of is in there somewhere. And so, I've always wrote happy endings, but I think I'm now more, infuse stories with hope, because we do have, however terrible things are, there is the ultimate happy ending, awaits us. And that does kind of lift us, up and outwards. So I think for now it's just infusing what I do. I think I'm writing a book for adults. I'm not sure. It seems to be emerging.
Sorry, I love that you say, I think I'm writing a book.
They can kind of creep up on you, and that will have more God overtly in it. But when I write for children, I think it's just infusing but who knows? Maybe there'll be a call to write a book that's more emphatically and kind of obvious.
Susannah, it has been such a pleasure having you on Finding Hope today. Thank you so much for sharing a bit about your life and your journey and your faith. It has been, a real blessing. I think other people are really going to relate to your story. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much to Susannah McFarlane for sharing her story today. You can find Susannah's book, Heartlines, The Year I Met My Other Mother, on Booktopia and Amazon, and you can find that information in the show notes as well. I'm Georgia, and thank you for listening to this episode of Finding Hope. To help this podcast reach more people, you can rate, review, subscribe, and share it with a friend who might need a little extra hope right now. For now, I'll leave you with this verse. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7. Catch you next time.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.